Hello, and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing trends and developments in Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Grace Carroll, and I will be your moderator for the program today. Today, we are glad to welcome two very distinguished scholars to our program. First, a warm welcome to Dr. David Lampton. Dr. Lampton is Dean of Faculty, Professor, and Director of China Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Prior to this, he served as President of the National Committee on United States-China Relations in New York City from 1988 to 1997. Currently, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also serves on the Board of Advisors for the National Bureau of Asian Research. Dr. Lampton is also a prolific writer and has appeared on various radio and television programs dedicated to examining current developments in the U.S.-China relationship. Thank you for joining us again,
Good
sir.
to be with you.
All right. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Robert Sutter, Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. In addition to teaching full-time, Dr. Sutter has published many books, articles, and government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries, focusing on their relations with the United States. Prior to teaching at George Washington and Georgetown, his government career spanned the Library of Congress, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of State, and the National Intelligence Council, where he served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Dr. Lampton, you were a guest on our last program where we discussed the upcoming leadership transition that's taking place this year at the 18th National People's Congress. Now, it's been a couple of months, and Xi Jinping's visit on February 14th seems to confirm that he is slated to emerge as one of the core leaders in the upcoming transition. So why now? What do China and the United States hope to achieve out of this visit? And of course, Dr. Sutter, if you'd like to add anything, please do.
Fine.
I see two big reasons for right now. Of course, the 18th Party Congress in the fall of this year will fix his party leadership position, and then there'll be another meeting in the spring of next year that'll affix formally his state position. And then there's yet another position as head of the Military Affairs Commission, and we'll have to see when he assumes that post. So this is a kind of transition that's going to happen in China over time. But why the trip now? I think really two reasons. One is that it's very important for leaders at the highest level of each system to have, particularly between major powers, personal understanding and understanding of each other's political circumstance, why they can accommodate some demands, why they cannot accommodate others. And I think this is part of a very systematic and I think very good process that both sides are engaged in having the top leaders in our two countries know one another as well as possible. And this was started by Vice President Biden. He went to China not long ago, and he's also met with President-to-be, I will say, Xi, in Rome, and they've talked by telephone, my understanding. So they began to build a relationship. That will continue, and President Obama will have an opportunity to join this process, so to speak, of mutual understanding. I think there's one other big reason, in my view, and that is that one of the big problems in the relationship is increasing mutual strategic mistrust. And I think it's very important that this relationship, looking forward, do all that it can be done to minimize that strategic mistrust. And so I think the Chinese look at our recent foreign policy of looking towards Asia with, let's say, increasing vigor. I think they have some suspicion about that policy. Conversely, the United States is hopeful but not certain how China will use its growing power. And so I think anything that can be done to reassure one another that we will be mindful of each other's interests and cooperative in spirit will be very essential as we look ahead.
Okay. Oh, do you have anything to add to that?
I think this is I agree with everything that has been said. I put it in the context of the beginning of the Obama government with dealing with China. And if we recall how optimistic people were, we had talks of a G2 between the two countries. And that didn't work out. we have differences between our two sides. And so we're in the process now of managing those differences in pragmatic ways and building common ground in a business-like way. And this process is very important. I'm not sure we're going to build a lot of trust in this regard. I think what we're going to do is build predictability and build business-like relationships. And I think both sides are in the business of doing that. If you look at it from an interest-based perspective, you say, well, this is in the interest of the Chinese administration on balance, and it's certainly in the interest of the United States. But I think our expectations of building much more cooperative relationships with our two leaderships, I think we have to keep that at least in the context of what it was 3 or 4 years ago when we were too optimistic. And I think we should be a bit more realistic, perhaps, about that. But I think I'm not disagreeing with what's said. I'm putting it in a different context. And I'm coming from that context, which is we had to lower our expectations a little bit in looking at these two situations, in looking at the situation today.
Okay, certainly. I think what's interesting is she seems to be regarded as a personable figure. And, you know, it does seem that there is remarkably little that is known about him and his views on the West. So what should we know about his background? What should we know about his experiences that shaped his manner of behaving before assuming the vice presidency and presumably the presidency later this year?
Well, I guess I would question the premise a little bit. Of course, there's an enormous amount we do not know about Mr. Xi. And what we don't know is much larger than what we do know. But I think we know enough to at least begin the process of dealing on a more interest-based basis with him. We know he's been the leader, party, and state leader in 3 of China's provincial level units that are most trade-oriented, most coastal, most cosmopolitan. In Fujian province, in Zhejiang province, in Shanghai. Now, he was only in Shanghai a short period of time. But in all of these places, basically the economies of each of those localities was very dependent on the external world market and its globalization links. And he had to deal with a wide range of foreign interests and individuals in those positions. So there's no reason on earth to think he is not at least fully cognizant of China's interests with respect to globalization. Secondly, his father was very close to Deng Xiaoping, and in the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping chose his father to go to Guangdong province next to Hong Kong and essentially build the policy that became the special economic zones and China's outreach to the world. Deng, out of all the people he could have chosen, chose his father. Now, sons don't always act in accordance with their fathers, but that's one little piece of evidence. He grew up in a family and a location that was very cosmopolitan and on the cutting edge of reform. We also know he was the secretary for one of China's most famous generals, a man named Geng Biao, and he had some experience in the Central Military Commission. He's not a decorated soldier, and don't want to exaggerate that. But he has, I'd say, more personal knowledge of the military than his 2 immediate predecessors did. So from my viewpoint, I can see quite a few hopeful but not definitive indicators of how we might expect him to behave.
Okay. And Dr. Sutter?
Well, sure. I agree with that very much. China's in a period of collective leadership, and so he's the senior of the collective leaders. He's not a particularly strong person in that leadership. I mean, I think this is, he has to be careful how he carries things out, but his inclinations, his experiences will make a difference, and he will be the top person. But it is collective, and so he'll be constrained as well. And so it's just another episode here when we remember the visit of Hu Jintao as vice president to Washington, D.C. about 10 years ago. there was a lot of excitement that he was going to be a reformer and he was going to change things and this type of thing. And as an individual, Hu Jintao probably had a better chance of doing that when he was at that stage than Mr. Xi does. I think Hu Jintao is more powerful in a way than Mr. Xi is today. He's a bit less powerful than Hu Jintao was at that point. And so, that's just an observation I'm making to underline that this is a leader that is constrained. And there are a lot of different forces that are coming to play, and his personal instincts and personal approach will make a difference, but it will be in a context of very broad, agreed upon norms that will be followed by the collective leadership.
I might just add, I think there will be a straw in the wind here, and that is if he manages to acquire the leadership of the Central Military Commission very close to his acquisition of these other two state and party posts, then I think there would be basis to argue he may end up looking a little stronger than Hu Jintao, because Hu Jintao didn't get the formal control of the military chairmanship of the Military Affairs Commission till 2 years after his nominal succession. So we'll all be interested in whether he does that. Xi is able to acquire that post right off. But I basically agreed the trajectory of leadership strength from Mao to Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao to Xi is one of diminished personal stature and increased power of the collectivity. That's the basic trend, and whether he ticks up a little or ticks down a little, I imagine that general trend will continue.
Okay. I think you both brought up two kind of interesting dimensions that people in America are very concerned about in dealing with China. One is the trade issue, and the other is the security dimension. So I want to shift to the security dimension for a little bit. At the beginning of this year, President Obama mentioned that there was going to be a pivot to Asia in terms of our national defense. What do you think the Chinese response is to this? How have they taken this, and do we see this playing any role in the upcoming visit? I guess, Dr. Sutter.
Well, this is it's a very high-profile type of pivot. So the publicity is very strong on this. The reality is building on a base that was already there. The Bush administration was very active strategically throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, they're getting out of the Obama government is moving out of Iraq and Afghanistan, which allows them to do more in Asia-Pacific. But actually what's happening from a strategic point of view is moving ships and service people and things like that is not very big. So it's a lot more diplomacy, a lot more public relations, and trade policy is important. The TPP program is important, and it's an orientation for the future and of attention. And I think this is all to the good. It's a very important area of the world for the United States. This is an area of great significance. And China views this skeptically. Many in China see this as directed against them, and probably some of it is directed against them, if not in stated form, in reality. Because China's been behaving in certain ways that, from the American point of view, are seen as very much against American interest. So there is tension, there is competition. There's competition. This is competition. It's over what kind of an order will prevail in the international economic order that will be important in the Asia-Pacific, what kind of a security order you're going to have in the region. And the U.S. is also competing for its values in the region, and those are all against China, those values. And so these areas are areas of tension with China. They've always been there. These are not new areas of tension, and they're highlighted a bit more. And so it's another area that has to be managed in our relationship, which has been managed. Keep in mind that, in my view at least, U.S.-China relations is full of things that are really good and full of things that are complications and competition and conflict to a degree. And they have to be managed. And the wonderful thing about the leaders of both sides is that they focus on the common ground as much as they can and pragmatically deal with the areas of difference. And that's what I hope Mr. Xi will do. That's what I expect him to do. And that's what I see in the process of the U.S. side and the Chinese side, pragmatically dealing with these issues of like the pivot and misunderstandings, trying to clarify the situation, and moving forward in areas where they can move forward, and reserving their differences without making them too salient.
I would largely agree with that. I would just note with respect to the U.S. side, there have been somewhat different, let's say, singing the same music, but the key may be a little different among the Defense Department,
Fortissimo
the White
versus
House. Right,
piano. Huh?
Right, yes. So I wouldn't say we're on the sort of the same song, but the keys are a little different, and I think so our own government is trying to harmonize its own message a little better. But I agreed with everything that was just said. What I could usefully comment on is I was just in Beijing interviewing among Chinese, well, let's just say thought leaders and middle-level officials about their response and interpretation to this new, or let us say repeated in some sense, music that they're hearing. And I think first of all, they responded more moderately and more in a modulated tone than I would have expected. And for many reasons. Partly they may have wanted just to indicate to me they were more relaxed than perhaps they are. But I think they had a number of questions that, in a sense, lead them to be a little more relaxed than I might have thought. First of all, they do start from the premise that we both have very big economic and other interests in common while there are all this conflict. And so the United States will pursue its interests, and to the degree to which they're compatible interests, this will stabilize the relationship. Secondly, I think they believe that while the United States might hope for a big, quote, peace dividend from moving out of Afghanistan at some point, and Iraq, we're way along on the road on that, that there's still going to be a lot of complications elsewhere in the world that are going to call for our attention. And so the degree to which we can really reorient our attention, probably the U.S. can do so to some extent, but we have Syria we're now worried about, we have Iran we're now worried about, there's the ongoing, of course, Palestinian-Israel problem. So that they're not convinced that the United States will be able to reorient as dramatically as some of the rhetoric might suggest. Secondly, they just have to read our business page to understand we've got a budget problem. We've already committed to cutting out about $460 billion out of the defense budget, and more probably will come before this is over, so that the ability, resource-wise, the U.S. is going to be constrained. Thirdly, they look at, of course, part of the reasons we're reoriented in this direction is because countries on China's periphery were alarmed at Chinese foreign policy in 2009 and 2010. I think the Chinese believe to some extent they can undo, which I think they recognize was a damaging policy, or at least mitigate the damage and therefore take that pressure off. Also, they don't believe that the United States necessarily wants to get involved in all the territorial disputes with the Philippines and Vietnam and so forth. And so while, yes, China has its claims and the things that we're not fully, South China Sea claims that we're quite alarmed about, on the other hand, we don't want to necessarily become embroiled in everybody else's problems in this region as well. So the Chinese, at least when I was talking, projected a certain confidence that this wasn't going to go as far as at least some of the fortissimo singing in Washington went.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's a lot to think about there, obviously, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds in this upcoming week. But I wanted to turn to what's actually happening during this visit. I see that on the docket there's a visit to Iowa and to, I believe, California. What is happening in each of these places? Why does she want to go to Iowa? If you could enlighten us.
Now, facetious people in Washington sometimes say, why does he want to go to Iowa in the middle of the winter? Apparently he spent time in Iowa, and he wants to be, so this is going to be sort of showing him in a positive, sort of personal way. They're going to reunite him with the family that was hosting him when he was in Iowa 20 years ago. And he's going to meet with the governor, who was an official then, maybe the governor at the time. I can't remember. That's what I've been reading anyway. So in any event, it's going to be sort of a sentimental journey to Iowa. But maybe he'll buy some soybeans too, and because one of the things that the Chinese will do to ease trade tensions is to have a few high-profile purchases, which will show that they are sincere in trying to balance the trade between the two countries, at least symbolically. And then Los Angeles is, as I understand it, is business. He's going to meet with they're going to get together investors from China, CEOs from China, CEOs from the United States, and they're going to see where they have common ground, and they probably have a lot. And so they'll, what are the hurdles to doing business on the respective sides? This type of good, pragmatic, results-oriented type of discussion, and I think that'll probably have a good effect. And putting the differences that we have over trade issues and others in some context, because we have a lot of benefit from these economic relationships too. And again, some other purchases may be the order of the day in California as well.
Well, I absolutely agree, but I think there's also a more deep point about Chinese understanding of American politics. When leaders first came here after normalization and so on, generally their idea of America was Washington, D.C. for political power, and New York for economic power, and the rest of the country in geographic, cultural, and other terms was kind of a fog for them. And they've over time come to find that our Congress is unlike the National People's Congress. It's a co-equal branch that actually influences things. And they further found that every state has 2 senators, irrespective of their population. So if they want to be effective, building support, particularly in the U.S. Senate, and the farm states occupy a lot of votes in the U.S. Senate, this is important. And so I think underneath this, it implies a recognition by the Chinese that a lot of people count in the United States, and this is an attempt to reach out to them in both a human sense, because I think the Chinese understand Hu Jintao was seen as a little standoffish, maybe a gray bureaucrat. And I think there is an effort, and it maybe have some genuine origin in his personality. I think he may be a bit more of a people person. And so I think this may be an attempt to showcase that quality to him.
Okay, that's definitely very interesting, particularly the growing Chinese understanding of how government functions differently in America. On that point, I was just interested in what the Chinese expectations were. At the beginning of the program, you both said that part of this is about gaining sort of a more of a comprehensive ongoing relationship between the U.S. and Chinese administrations. What about the upcoming U.S. election and how that might impact? What are the Chinese expectations if there is a change in administration at the end of the year?
Very good question. I mean, we need a Republican candidate, and we don't quite have one yet. And the rhetoric in the Republican primaries has been quite negative about China, more negative than just about any other place I've seen in the country. And so the question is, will they follow through? Whoever gets elected on the Republican side, if they get elected, would they follow through in a much tougher policy toward China? My reading of public opinion in the country, my reading of interest groups in the United States on pro and con, looking at that, I said that won't enjoy a lot of support. A really tough policy toward China is not in the interest of the United States at this particular time in the minds of public opinion, in the mainstream views in the Congress. And so I think that so I'm not too worried about it. I think partisanship is the big question mark I have in looking at China policy in the future. In other words, the substance of it, the interest groups, the public opinion, other things, could that drive the policy in a negative direction? I don't see it as strong enough to do that. But partisanship, if things get really very partisan, and that becomes the uppermost important thing, and that were to dominate China policy, then that could lead to if a Republican got elected, they could come to power and follow this course. But I think that's, adding all those things up, it's fairly remote. And so my sense is if the Chinese probably have a calculation, they look at the various, they can see the polls. They know Congress quite well. They canvass Congress all the time, and they understand the interest groups. And so I think that at the end, and the media, and so they look at this, and I think they come to their calculation, and basically I think they think it's going to more or less continue the way it is, whether it's Obama or a Republican president. But the wild card, I'd say this is a wild card, is partisanship. If partisan and China, if the two come together, I just don't think they will come together, because in foreign affairs, I don't think it's that big a deal. I think Afghanistan is a big deal. Things like that are much bigger deals, and of course the budget is the basic big deal. And so there are too many other things overshadowing China to make it that big a deal. And so I think it's so when I add it all up, I say it's probably pretty much the same.
I think we only have a few minutes left. Do you have anything
Well,
to add to that?
I agree with everything that's said, and certainly in that I do. I just add a couple of things. One is that Xi Jinping and the people, particularly his staff that arrange a trip, have to be very mindful that he not be, quote, embarrassed in any way when he's here. And of course, we're such a diverse political system, it's a little difficult for us to make sure that wouldn't happen. So I think they are worried about what you might call the political volatility in the United States at the particular moment he's coming. And I doubt anything untoward is going to happen. But I think that is a concern to them coming at this particular time, because they want him to come out of this trip with as much stature in the eyes of his own people as possible. The only other thing I would say is I think the Chinese look at the record of the preceding 8 administrations and sort of see a pattern, and which most Americans would recognize, and that is, in the primaries you run to the extreme of your party, consolidate your activists, and then in the general election you run to the center, because that's where most of the votes are. And so they, I think, see a very great tendency in our political system to pull back towards the middle. And so I think they're not totally relaxed, and they shouldn't totally discount what they hear in the heat of campaign rhetoric. But the long and the short of it is, economically, China's our most rapidly growing, and has been for a decade, rapidly growing export market. And that is a pretty important fact when you get down to concrete decisions.
Okay, great. I believe that is all the time we have for this program today. Thank you so much for coming and telling us more about this very exciting upcoming visit that I'm sure everyone's eagerly waiting for. Again, thank you, Dr. Lampton and Dr. Sutter. And thank you to our viewers at home for joining us on this program. We hope to see you at our next program.